This is the Spectator's considered verdict to what the politicians are proposing right now. And it's not so much the mechanics of it, although they're pretty identical to what the press is proposing itself. It's the idea that three political parties should get together and decide how the press in Britain should be regulated. That's not the way we do things in Britain. It hasn't been for generations. And what's at stake here is a principle, the principle of a free press, and the idea that politicians should not be involved at all in how the press is regulated. So that's why I don't think newspapers could, in all conscience, sign up to what the government is proposing. It would send a very bad signal to the rest of the world, and it would sacrifice a fundamental liberty that's been held dear in this country, even for longer than democracy itself.
Well, yes, and when you put that point to the likes of Brian Cathcart from Hacked Off, who's been campaigning on behalf of victims of press abuse, he would say there's no risk of political interference. He said that's just an excuse by the press rather than a real reason. He says that, you know, at the moment Parliament could ban newspapers if they wanted to, and they don't. They wouldn't interfere.
Yes, that's right. And when you look at the practical effects of it, nobody's saying that the press would be cowed overnight if this were passed. It's just the question of whether you want a system or live in a country where the politicians can collectively decide how they want the newspapers to be run or not. There are countries like that in the world, and Britain should not join the long and ignominious list of countries where the state does license the press. This isn't about how the newspapers would actively be regulated by the government. It's the fact that the government wants to regulate them in the first place.
And yet there may be many people watching who watched a lot of the evidence that was given when Leveson took evidence from victims of press abuse who say we're sick of the press, as they would say, marking their own homework. Changes need to be made and we need to be tougher.
And changes are being made. I mean, the press has lost, for a start, has lost about 20% of its circulation since Leveson started his inquiry. So it is rapidly declining. But also, the new regulator is the most robust regulator in the Western world. This is what the press is offering. It is the Leveson report, to the millimetre. The press will do this, but just on its own terms, without the politicians telling them to. And that's what this argument is about. It's not whether there's going to be tougher regulation. Of course there is. The newspapers have collectively agreed that there will be. The question is whether you want politicians to call the shots. And the answer to that is a very clear no.
So your instinct is then, Fraser Nelson, that you and some other newspapers will sign up to your own version, your own regulator, and the government's version will go ahead concurrently. They'll go on at the same time.
Yes, and I think this will be a pretty good result. You get to exactly the same place, the principles of Lord Leveson's report enacted, but you'll just get there the traditional British way, which is through freedom, through the press doing it, responding to the challenge which, as you rightly say, the public has set to them, and it will not be done by parliamentary edict. I mean, the language used in today's Royal Charter is literally medieval, because you'd have to rewind the clock 300 years to go back to the last time the politicians gave marching orders to the press. OK, Fraser Nelson, thanks very much indeed. And we're expecting tomorrow's newspapers, of course, to have an awful lot on that story. We'll be taking a first look at what's on the front pages in our press previews at 10:30.